Grim morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering St. James Cemetery, located in Liverpool, England. The aroma of coffee mingles in the air. The gates stand open. Step carefully. It's time to descend into the hauntings of history. The familiar story of parish graveyards pushed to their breaking point, of overcrowding, contagion, and the promise of reform through garden cemeteries, has been told repeatedly here on the Grim when discussing the Victorian era, but explanations alone can feel distant. They inform, but they don't always linger. A single example can haunt for far longer than a lesson, and that's where St. James comes in. Opened in 1829 and closed in 1936, St. James is a Victorian cemetery by age, but not by ideal. It was created to relieve Liverpool's most overburdened burial grounds, yet it carried their worst habits straight through its gates. Complaints of shallow graves, disturbed remains, and improper burials followed it almost from the beginning. What greets you today when you step through its iron entrances feels less like a resolution and more like a consequence. St. James is compelling because it was meant to be an answer. Instead, by clinging to the practices of old graveyards, it became something else entirely, a quiet haunting no one anticipated. Officially, the grounds are now listed as a city park, but can you truly call it St. James Gardens or a park at all when some 57,000 souls still lie beneath the grass? In August 1825, Liverpool gathered inside its town hall to confront a problem the city could no longer bury out of sight. The graveyards were full. The dead were pressing too close to the living. A solution was proposed, a new public cemetery, orderly, secure, and aligned with the Church of England. One model not on the chaos of English burial grounds, but on the calm geometry of continental Europe, where simplicity, distance, and restraint promised dignity and death. Just months earlier, Liverpool Necropolis had opened as a nonconformist burial ground. St. James was intended to be its counterpart, angelic and respectable and modern. Shares were sold, plans were drawn, and a former stone quarry hollowed out by centuries of extraction was selected as the site. The quarry had already given Liverpool its docks, its town hall, and much of its civic pride. Now it would receive something else entirely. In 1826, a young architect named John Foster Jr. was entrusted with an ambitious commission to create a new kind of burial ground, inspired by the Great Garden Cemetery of Père Lachaise in Paris. £20,000 were raised by public subscription, a testament to the city already aware of its relationship with the dead that needed to change. Foster laid out the cemetery across descending ground, shaping it as both landscape and statement. At its northern height, he placed the oratory, a severe windowless structure in the Greek Revival style. Here, funeral services were laid out before the dead were carried onward to their graves. The building still stands, rarely opened now, its interior housing monumental statues salvaged from the cemetery itself. Outside the gates, a bronze sculpture by Tracy Emin stands silent watch, visible but distant, like a modern intrusion into an older ritual of mourning. Nearby once stood a house for a minister, positioned on the site later claimed by the cathedral. Nothing of it survives, no foundation, no plaque, just absence. To the south, Foster marked the cemetery's entrance with ceremony and control, a monumental stone arch and porter's lodge, built from the same pale material as the oratory. For decades, it served practical purposes, housing council workmen as the cemetery declined around it. In 1997, it was restored and reborn as a private home. The gatekeeper turned resident, living quite literally at the threshold between the living city and the dead it once guarded. By 1829, St. James Cemetery was finally consecrated, yet the burial ground possessed one defining feature that still unsettles visitors today. It descends into the earth rather than rising above it. Towering quarry walls enclose its winding paths, terraces, and catacombs, carved directly into exposed rock. Funeral carriages process downward along sloping ramps, disappearing into a space that felt removed from the city, yet sat squarely within it. From the very beginning, St. James looked different, and it filled quickly, too quickly. By the mid 19th century, the cemetery was swallowing thousands each year. At its peak, there were 7 burials a day. For the poor, however, St. James changed very little. Graves that should have been deep and reserved for a single soul were instead stacked, coffins layered atop one another, sometimes holding 30 or more bodies, separated by inches of soil at best. Regulations existed absolutely. Whether they were followed was another matter entirely. Reform takes time, but dealing not just with the dead, but with the dead who were poor were treated as an inconvenience. As cholera swept through the cities and public health fears mounted, St. James became a focal point of anxiety. Doctors warned of dangerous emanations. Reformers pointed to shallow graves and disturbed remains. The very cemetery meant to embody progress had recreated the conditions it was built to escape. Debate followed it for decades. Petitions demanded closure. Residents complained of graves being reopened, of burials continuing long after cemeteries had been established beyond city limits. Even proposals to build a cathedral atop a filled in dead quarry were floated and fiercely opposed. To some, St. James had become an embarrassment. To others, it remained consecrated ground, untouchable. Still, the burials continued. By 1936, the cemetery had reached its limits. After 57,774 burials, its gates finally closed. What followed wasn't reverence, but neglect. Gravestones toppled and vanished. Paths blurred. Nature and vandalism worked in tandem. By the time a project was completed in 1972 to transform the grounds into a public park, the vast majority of the markers had been cleared away. What remains is a landscape shaped by memory and erasure alike, a cemetery designed to dignify the dead, later stripped of their names, and finally reimagined as a green space. The dead are still here, it's only their voices that have been quieted. Yet something else creeps in, the unease of how many souls lie buried here, present but lost within the grounds. As you descend into the cemetery, you're abruptly confronted by the gravestones that list name after name, not above their corresponding plots, but gathered along the paths instead. Some stones bear 30 names or more, a roll call of the dead compressed into a single marker. They speak silently of mass burials below, of coffins stacked into the earth, and of lives reduced to lists. It's an arrangement that unsettles even the most composed visitor. Last week, I asked whether Victorian cemeteries still have a place in the modern world. Should we continue to remember those within their walls as cemeteries, or are gardens and memorial parks more fitting? St. James doesn't have the luxury of that debate. The decision was made decades ago, its identity rewritten without real consultation of the effects. And yet, walking its paths, a feeling of desecration lingers. Graves remain, but gravestones don't. The absence suggests something uncomfortable, that without names the dead are worth less, that memory, once inconvenient, can be cleared away like stone. Many of those buried at St. James were considered poor in life, but poverty didn't make them inconsequential. Their labor built the city, their lives sustained it, and some among them left marks that reached far beyond Liverpool, echoing long after their bodies were lowered into the quarried earth. One, in fact, might have been considered a miracle of her time. Sarah Biffin was born on the 25th of October in 1784 in a small village of East Quantuxet Head, Somerset, into a world that offered little mercy to bodies deemed unfinished. She arrived without arms, her legs only faintly formed, a condition now known as phocomelia. She would grow to just 37 inches tall. What she lacked in limbs, society assumed she lacked in possibility. It was wrong. Raised in a cramped farm worker's cottage by her father, a shoemaker, and her mother, Sarah learned early that survival required ingenuity. She taught herself to read. Later, she learned to write by holding the pen in her mouth. It was not defiance at first, but necessity. At 13, she was apprenticed to Emmanuel Dukes, a showman who carried her from fair to fair across England. There, beneath painted banners and gawking crowds, she was displayed as the eighth wonder. Audiences paid to watch her sew, draw, and write with her mouth. Somewhere amid spectacle and exploitation, Sarah learned to paint. She balanced the brush between her teeth and began to produce landscapes and miniature portraits on ivy, works of such precision that astonishment slowly gave way to respect. Duke sold them for 3 guineas apiece. Sarah herself, though, earned almost nothing. In 1808 at St. Bartholomew's Fair, her life shifted. She was painted on the side of a showman's van as a mermaid, a creature half real, half myth. Here George Douglas, Earl of Morton, asked to see her work without interference. He watched her paint across multiple sittings, carried the unfinished miniature away with him, and returned convinced. Sarah Biffin was no curiosity. She was an artist. Under Morton's patronage, she studied with Royal Academy painter William Craig. Court doors opened. The Society of Arts awarded her a medal in 1821. The Royal Academy accepted her paintings. She painted miniature portraits for George III, George IV, William IV, and Queen Victoria herself. For a time, Sarah Biffen stood where talent alone was meant to stand. She opened a studio on the Strand. She traveled to Brussels and painted for royalty there. Charles Dickens would later reference her in his novels, invoking her as both marvel and metaphor. Yet even acclaim proved fragile. In 1824, she married William Stephen Wright, a bank clerk. The marriage failed, but the consequences lingered. Though separated, Wright retained control of her earnings, paying her a modest allowance from the money she herself had made. When the Earl of Morton died in 1827, the scaffold beneath her success collapsed. Without noble protection, commissions dwindled. She returned to exhibiting under the name Mrs. E. M. Wright, then later reclaimed Miss Biffen, painting once more to survive. Queen Victoria granted her a small civil list pension, just £12 a year. It was enough to endure but not thrive. In 1841, Sarah retreated to Liverpool, setting up a quiet studio and withdrawing from public life. Friends and admirers later organized a public subscription to support her final years, a belated acknowledgement of what she had given and what had been taken. She died on the 2nd of October in 1850, aged 66. Unlike some of the stones lined on the paths, her gravestone no longer exists. What remains are her works, portraits painted without hands, precision achieved through teeth and breath, lives captured by a woman the world first sold as a wonder and only slowly learned to see as an artist. Today her paintings hang in the National Portrait Gallery, the Wellcome Collection, and the Museum of Somerset. Her legacy endures quietly, like so many of the dead beneath St. James, present, profound, and too often overlooked. She's not alone in that obscurity. Even war heroes buried on this ground have, like their gravestones, slipped from memory. Arthur Herbert Lindsay Richardson, born on the 23rd of September in 1872 in the quiet seaside town of Southport, England. His early life followed a sensible, steady path. He apprenticed under a dental surgeon, learning a careful trade that promised security and respectability. But even then, it was clear that a life lived neatly indoors would never be enough for him. Something restless lived beneath the surface, a pull toward distance and danger that couldn't be ignored. At just 19 years old, Arthur left England behind and crossed the Atlantic to Canada. He first settled in Stony Mountain, Manitoba, where the land stretched wide and raw, shaped by more weather than people. After a few years, he moved west again, this time to Regina, Saskatchewan. The frontier offered hardship, but it also offered purpose. On the 7th of May in 1894, Arthur was accepted in the Northwest Mounted Police, joining an institution still finding its footing alongside a young nation. After training, he was posted to the Battleford, at a meeting point at the Battle of the Saskatchewan Rivers, a place where law, order, and the uncertainty met daily. There he built a modest life, serving quietly and faithfully. Then, a half a world away, war began to call. When volunteers were requested for service in South Africa, Arthur didn't hesitate. On the 14th of February in 1900, he was accepted into a newly formed regiment known as Dracona's Horse. It should have marked the new beginning of a proud and defining chapter. Instead, it nearly ended before it began. During rough seas on the voyage, Arthur fell down the ship's hold and broke his leg badly. While his comrades prepared for combat, he lay behind, injured and frustrated, watching the war move forward without him. But fate wasn't finished with him yet. While he recovered in Cape Town, a group of 50 reinforcement soldiers arrived, ready to join the regiment at the front. On the 5th of November, near a place called Wivesprat, Arthur was placed in charge of leading them to rejoin the unit. Along the march, they encountered a Boer force of roughly 80 men. A brief chase followed before the truth became clear. They were badly outnumbered. The order to retreat was given. In the confusion of withdrawal, Corporal MacArthur was shot twice and thrown from his horse. Surrounded by gunfire, wounded and helpless, he was left exposed. Many would have pressed on. Many would have told themselves there was nothing they could do. Arthur did not. Sergeant Richardson turned his horse and rode back into the storm of bullets. Under heavy crossfire, he reached the fallen corporal, lifted him onto his horse, and carried him to safety. It was a moment measured not in strategy or rank, but on instinct and compassion, one man refusing to abandon another. For that single act of extraordinary courage, Arthur Herbert Lindsay Richardson was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor for bravery in the British Empire. He returned to Canada in 1901 and quietly resumed his duties in the Northwest Mounted Police in Battleford, remaining there until 1906. There was no grand victory parade waiting for him, no appetite for spectacle. His life returned to routine, though it had been irrevocably marked by what he had done. Not long after leaving the force, tragedy struck again. His wife passed away, leaving him widowed and unmoored. In 1916, he made another long journey, returning to England and settling in the Liverpool area. There, astonishingly, he faded into near anonymity. For years, he lived an ordinary life while the world forgot him. It wasn't until April 7th, 1924, that his name surfaced once more. The Liverpool Echo contacted him after discovering that a man who had falsely claimed to be the Victoria Cross recipient had died. For 9 years, this impostor had received honors and recognition meant for Arthur. Rumors had even circulated that the real Sergeant Richardson had died in Canada. Reading the article, Arthur finally chose to speak out. Through this strange correction of history, he was reunited with his mother and brother for the first time in more than 20 years. On the 26th of June 1920, King George V invited Arthur to an afternoon gathering at Buckingham Palace, honoring him alongside other Victoria Cross recipients. It was a rare moment of ceremony in a life defined far more by quiet endurance than applause. Back in Liverpool, Arthur worked as a track layer for the local tramway. The man who had once ridden into gunfire now laid rails through the city's streets, his heroism unnoticed by most who passed him each day. He died on the 15th of February, 1932, at the age of 59. Arthur Herbert Lindsay Richardson left no grand monument behind him, but his legacy lives in a single unyielding choice: to turn back, to risk everything, and to save another life. And sometimes that is the truest kind of immortality. But not all within the grounds were poor or heroes. In fact, it was directly the opposite. William Huskisson was born on the 11th of March in 1770 at Birtsmorton Court, Worcestershire, into privilege, education, and expectation. From the beginning, his life moved along ordered lines: grammar school, foreign tutelage, political patronage. Few men of his era seemed better prepared for power, or more convinced that progress, properly managed, could be made rational. As a boy, Huskisson was sent to Paris, where history broke open around him. He lived there through the early convulsions of the French Revolution, watching monarchy weaken and ideology harden. He aligned himself with moderation, joining the Club of 1789 and delivering a speech on revolutionary currency that earned him the reputation as a financial mind of rare clarity. Order, not chaos, was his creed. Reform, not rupture. Back in Britain, his ascent was swift. Protected by Henry Dundas and William Pitt the Younger, Huskisson entered government service, first overseeing the Aliens Act during a time of revolutionary panic, then rising to Undersecretary at War. Parliament followed. So did influence. Though rarely theatrical in debate, he became indispensable behind the scenes, shaping fiscal policy, commercial legislation, and the machinery of empire. Huskisson believed deeply in free trade and economic liberalism. He opposed the Corn Laws, reformed the Navigation Acts, dismantled labor protections, and reduced tariffs, convinced that markets left unshackled would regulate themselves more efficiently than law ever could. Then starving weavers appealed for a minimum wage. He dismissed the idea as dangerous folly. His reforms helped modernize Britain's economy, but they also left many behind. By the 1820s, he stood at the center of power as the president of the Board of Trade and the Member of Parliament for Liverpool, a port city built on commerce, shipping, and the moral compromises of empire. He supported colonial governance structures that preserved slavery in practice, even as abolitionist pressure mounted. Progress for Huskisson remained abstract, statistical, and distant. Then came the railway, and something Huskisson couldn't have foreseen. On the 15th of September in 1830, against medical advice and still recovering from surgery, Huskisson attended the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the embodiment of the future he had spent his life advancing: steam, speed, industry. He rode in the Duke of Wellington's train, pausing at Parkside Station amid celebration and confusion. When another locomotive, the Rocket, approached on the opposite line, warnings rang out. Huskisson hesitated. He moved forward, then back. He tried to climb into the Duke's carriage, but the door swung open at the wrong moment. Rockets struck it. Huskinson was thrown onto the tracks. His leg was crushed beneath iron wheels. The man who had measured risk in policy papers and parliamentary votes was undone in seconds by motion and momentum. He was carried away on a torn door, transported by locomotive once more, this time as a dying passenger. At the vicarage in Eccles, he dictated his will. At 9 that evening, he passed away from his injuries. The world immediately took notice. Newspapers across continents reported the incident. The railway was no longer an abstract promise. It was real, it was powerful, and it could kill. William Huskinson was buried at the center of St. James Cemetery in Liverpool. A monument rose above him. Statues followed, were moved, toppled, restored, relocated. His legacy proved as unsettled as the age he helped shape. He championed progress yet was destroyed by it. He believed in systems yet fell victim to their failure. Much like the grounds in which he lies, his future carried immense promise, only to be overtaken, quite literally, by risk unleashed too soon. Some adventures in life start by walking out your front door and a medical prescription. For Lucy Walker, it wasn't just part of her adventure, but a new meaning in her life. Walker was born in Canada but grew up in Liverpool, the daughter of a lead merchant, in a world that still placed firm expectations on what a woman's life should look like. Adventure was not among them, and yet long before she could ever set foot on a mountain, Lucy was already quietly defining those limits. In 1858, suffering from rheumatism, she was given what seemed like a harmless prescription by her doctor: walking. To strengthen her body, she was encouraged to take long walks, preferably in clean air. Accompanied by her father and brother, those walks soon carried her far from Liverpool's streets and into the Alps. What began as therapy became transformation. Lucy Walker discovered not just relief from pain, but a calling. She quickly proved herself on the high passes, crossing some of the most treacherous routes in the Alps. The following year, eager to push herself further, she set her sights on the Altels, a formidable peak in Switzerland. Her father suggested a guide named Melchior Anderegg. The partnership would last a lifetime. Altels was climbed successfully, and with it, Lucy's mountaineering career truly began. What followed was extraordinary. At the time when women were expected to observe, not conquer, Lucy steadily carved her way through alpine history. She took on Europe's most demanding climbs, including Mont Blanc and the Eiger, and achieved the first recorded ascent of the Baumhorn. Each summit was another quiet refusal to accept the limits placed upon her. In 1871, news reached her that her rival, American mountaineer Meta Brevert, was planning an attempt on Matterhorn, a peak already infamous for its danger. Lucy didn't hesitate. She hastily assembled a team, determined not to be left behind by history. On the 22nd of August, dressed not in practical climbing gear but in a white printed dress, Lucy Walker stood on the summit of Matterhorn. She became the first woman ever to do so, and overnight her name echoed far beyond the mountains. That same year, she completed her fourth ascent of the Eiger. It was said that during this climb, she survived largely on sponge cake, champagne, and asti spumante, a detail that only added to her legend and her refusal to conform. By 1909, Lucy joined the newly formed Ladies Alpine Club, where she was celebrated as the true pioneer of women climbers. By 1913, she had become its president, a role that reflected not only her achievements, but the door she had opened for others. Over the course of her life, Lucy completed an astonishing 98 alpine expeditions. She died quietly in her home in Liverpool on the 10th of September in 1916. No mountain marked her passing, no flags were raised, but her legacy was already secure. Etched into stone and sky, Lucy Walker proved that endurance, courage, and ambition know no gender, and that sometimes the most radical journeys begin with something as simple as walking out your front door. Situated in a low-lying quarry, the grounds of St. James are often soaked in fog, a pale blanket that settles without warning and lingers long after the city above is cleared. On many days, visibility shrinks, and the road narrows to winding paths and dark stone, leaving visitors to wonder if something else is moving within the mist, just beyond sight. Because the gates are not locked at night, people are free to come and go as they please. Footsteps echo, shadows stretch. But if the living may wander freely after dark, it raises a quieter, more unsettling question: what of the dead? Over the years, countless claims have surfaced that St. James is haunted, deeply, persistently haunted. Reports have multiplied of the souls whose names are etched in stones along its paths, said to linger where their identities were gathered together, even as their graves were left unmarked. and a place where the dead were so often disturbed, stacked, or forgotten. Many believe they were never truly given rest, and because of that, they still have something to say. One location draws more attention than most: Huskisson's tomb. It's here that visitors frequently report a lone figure, a man in a top hat walking with a pronounced limp, moving through the mist near the mausoleum. Huskisson's tomb still stands intact within the grounds, its distinctive circular form unmistakable, a neoclassical structure ringed with Corinthian columns. It's elegant, imposing, and impossible to ignore. So too are the stories. Time and again, witnesses have described the same mournful figure, pacing slowly, favoring one leg, lingering close to the tomb as if bound to it. Huskinson's death was sudden and violent. His death not ended by illness or age, but by catastrophe. For many, that abrupt ending suggests unfinished business, an interruption rather than a conclusion. And in a cemetery already heavy with unrest, it's perhaps no surprise he's said to remain, walking the paths long after the living have gone, unwilling or unable to leave the grounds where his story was so brutally cut short. However, another legend draws seekers into St. James, just as powerful: the tale of the Christmas vampire. The story surfaced in the 1970s, born from a wave of unsettling reports that have refused to fade. Witnesses spoke of a gray, smoke like figure, cloaked and watchful, said to stalk the areas around the cemetery and, in some accounts, attack nearby residents. Soon photographs began to circulate. Images are said to capture silvery, translucent forms drifting through the grounds, half seen and impossible to explain. Paranormal investigators were drawn in, claiming to record EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, during nighttime investigations. One recording in particular sent a chill through those who heard it: a quiet, unmistakable voice whispering a warning: "Don't tell anyone." The legend grew so enduring, so deeply woven into local lore, that it eventually made its way onto the page. Author Todd Selman chronicled the tale and its alleged victims in his book The Christmas Vampire, cementing the story's place in Liverpool's darker folklore. Whether truth or exaggeration, or something shaped by fear and fascination, the legend refuses to stay buried, much like the cemetery itself. But the legend carries a large problem. The Christmas vampire bears a striking resemblance to another figure of the same era, the Highgate vampire of London. Both stories emerged in the 1970s. Both described a silvery shadow haunting cemetery grounds, preying on victims after dark. The parallels are too difficult to ignore. Were these independent sightings, or echoes of the same fear, reshaped and retold? Whether myth or manifestation, the truth remains elusive. St. James offers no clear answers. Another presence is often spoken of: a woman in black, seen floating silently through the grounds. No name has ever been tied to her, no grave, no history. She simply appears, then vanishes, leaving behind only unease. Visitors also report cold spots that arrive without warning, disembodied voices carried on the air, and shadowy figures glimpsed just at the edge of vision. Many enter the gates hoping, perhaps guiltily, for a glimpse of the undead. If they are seen, some say they're not monsters at all, but residents searching for their lost stones, or loved ones wandering far from their original resting places. Along the east wall of the cemetery, a mysterious carving etched into the stone deepens the intrigue. Its origin is unknown. Some believe it marks the presence of a soul whose grave was never named, never marked, never remembered. Nearby, the cathedral looms, heavy with its own legends. Though often associated with St. James, it has no formal connection to the cemetery. It was built later, long after the ground had begun filling with the dead, and yet it carries an atmosphere just as charged, its shadow falling across the gardens like an unanswered question. As you pass the gravestones and make your way back toward the land of the living, a quiet feeling of desecration is difficult to ignore. Stones remain, but names are gone. Graves exist, but identities have been stripped away. It leaves visitors with an uncomfortable question, one that lingers long after the gates have closed behind them. Does preservation matter? Does leaving space for the Victorian dead still matter? Or, like so many buried beneath St. James, has that decision already been made? For now, the stories of St. James slip back into stone, and the dead return to their uneasy rest. Yet they're never silent for long. Thank you for walking with us through the veil into St. James Cemetery, descending once more into the hauntings of history. The gate is sealed, the veil drawn, yet death keeps no calendar, and so we shall return, as we always do, on the grim.